Hello, my name's Iain Law. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Birmingham, and I'm going to talk today about moral theory and specifically about utilitarianism. So before we get to utilitarianism, we need to talk a little bit about what kind of thing a moral theory is. So a moral theory is an attempt to say, in general, what makes the right action right or what makes the wrong action wrong. So we might ask about right acts more particularly. So you might be thinking, is it okay for me to cheat on this test? And you're not necessarily thinking about cheating in general, you're just thinking about this specific act of cheating. That's a moral question, but it's not necessarily a question about moral theory. If we're interested in moral theory, we want to know what property is it that the right acts have, all of the right acts in general. And the idea is, if we had a moral theory, then we'd be able to use it when we have new particular questions and new issues in applied ethics. So, moral theories could be thought of as sorting devices. You have an input of all the possible actions that you could be performing, and you have an output of them being sorted into moral categories, or being assigned what are sometimes called deontic statuses. So you have these actions, these possible actions, and they get sorted into those which are permissible, those which are impermissible, and those which are obligatory. In some moral theories, there's also a fourth category, the supererogatory. This is a rather ugly word, but it means something fairly easy to understand. It's actions which are very good, but not morally required, because they're so good that they go above and beyond the call of duty. They're more than it would be fair for ethics to demand of you. So the idea is, for all actions, we can sort them into one of these deontic statuses, we can put them in one of these moral categories. And what we want to know is, what's the right way of doing this sorting? Different moral theories offer us different ways of sorting actions into these categories and telling us which actions are the ones we must do, the right actions, the morally required, the obligatory actions, which ones are permissible, and which ones are impermissible, wrong. So just a note on terminology. In moral philosophy, we tend to use the word right to mean morally required, obligatory. The word good doesn't mean the same thing. If I say that an action or a state of affairs is good, I recommend it, but I don't absolutely say that it's required. But if I say that it's right, then I'm saying that it's required. At least this is the usage that is typically used in academic ethics. Okay, so what's distinctive about utilitarianism as a moral theory? Well, there are a number of features that utilitarianism has. The first one is that it's a consequentialist moral theory. So consequentialism is a broader category than utilitarianism. You can have a consequentialist moral theory that's not utilitarian, but what's distinctive of all consequentialist theories is they say that the morally salient properties of actions, the things that determine whether they get sorted into the right category or the wrong category or the permissible category, is just their results, just their consequences. So if I'm considering possible actions I could do, I could give money to one charity, I could spend it on myself, I could give it to a friend. If I'm trying to think about which is the right thing to do with this money, I should think about the consequences of each of those options. What would be the results of spending it on myself, giving it to a friend, giving it to charity? According to consequentialism, only the results matter. This can seem surprising because sometimes intuitively it seems like things other than future consequences matter. Things that happened in the past appear to be able to make a difference to whether an action is right or not. So, say for example, you had promised to meet a friend. It looks like the fact that you promised makes a moral difference to whether or not you ought to meet your friend. But that fact is in the past. So consequentialists either have to explain away the appearance that your promise in the past matters, or they have to give an explanation of why this matters in terms of future consequences. Consequentialists can probably do this in the case of promising. The fact that you promised in the past means that there are different future consequences for your not keeping your promise. Not keeping a promise means that your friend will experience feelings of being let down, of being betrayed, of you being a promise breaker, And all of that is in the category of future consequences. So that's relevant to your decision about whether breaking the promise or keeping the promise is the right thing to do. So, consequentialism, although it looks exclusively to the future, can sometimes accommodate intuitions about things in the past being morally relevant, but only indirectly, only insofar as they make a difference to what the future results will be. Okay, so that's consequentialism, but that doesn't tell us very much. There's more to being a utilitarian than being a consequentialist. So if I came along and said to you, here's the answer to what makes the right actions right, it's their consequences, you might very well respond and say, okay, but consequences for what? Which consequences? Here's the other distinctive thing about utilitarianism. Utilitarians think that the consequences that matter are consequences for welfare. If you go back to the 19th century, you will find the utilitarians of that time talking about happiness. So the famous utilitarian slogan is that the right action is whichever action out of the options available to you produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. These days, utilitarians have moved away from talking about happiness for the most part. This is probably because the meaning of the term happiness in everyday English has shifted slightly since the 19th century. So these days, when we talk about happiness, often we mean something relatively transitory, a passing mood. You can be happy one moment, sad the next. But the 19th century utilitarians weren't talking about maximizing that kind of happiness. When they talk about happiness, they mean happiness in a more stable, lasting kind of condition. Perhaps the same kind of thing that they mean in fairy stories when they say that they lived happily ever after. It doesn't mean, presumably, that they never experienced a moment's anxiety or distress ever again. They mean that their life overall was a happy one, a good one, a life which we would want to have for ourselves. So what the 19th century utilitarians termed happiness, contemporary utilitarians are more likely to call welfare, or well-being, or utility, or sometimes peculiar things like prudential value, but all of these mean the same thing. The idea is there are certain kinds of life which are good for the person living it. So good here isn't a moral good. This is an important point. This is why people talk about prudential value as opposed to moral value. The good here is good for the person leading it, in the same way that we might say of a plant that a certain amount of sunlight and a certain kind of soil and a certain amount of water was good for it. Or we might say of our pet that a certain diet was good for it, or chocolate was bad for it. So it's this notion of good for that we're working on when we think about good consequences, the consequences that matter to morality. So suppose I have two actions I could be performing. According to the utilitarians, I need to think about the consequences of those actions for the welfare of the people affected by those actions, or the good that they will experience or get from my actions. So go back to the money example. Suppose I find a £10 note lying on the street. I've got several options. I could spend it on myself. I could buy a book. I could buy a few cups of coffee. I could give it to a friend who I think needs some money. Or I could give it to a charity. And then the question arises, which charity? What the utilitarian says about all of these options is, consider how much good you would do with that money. So if I spent it on myself, if I bought that book, then the good for me is the increased pleasure or enjoyment of being able to read this book or of being able to possess this book. If I've got a friend who really needs money, maybe they need it for food, perhaps the welfare gain from £10 that my friend gets in having food that they really need is greater than the welfare gain I get for something which is just a kind of additional pleasure, the pleasure of reading a book. But consider how much benefit someone could get if I donated this £10 to the right kind of charity. By right kind of charity, I mean a charity that's effective, charity which makes that money go the furthest. So suppose that 2 malaria nets, mosquito nets that prevent malaria, could be bought with £10. That's 2 people who could be prevented from getting malaria, getting sick, and possibly dying. And so that's a much greater amount of benefit to be got from this £10. So the utilitarian approach is maximize the benefit. We could think of utilitarian decision-making as a cost-benefit analysis. So it says, look to the future, consider the outcomes, the results, the consequences of your possible actions, and do the one which has the greatest net benefit over cost. So you weigh up the costs, you weigh up the benefits, and you try to come up with the best sum. You're trying to maximize the amount of welfare, or as they would have said in the 19th century, the amount of happiness that you produce.